Hi, everybody. Settle in. We're here for our live show ahead of the Austrian Grand Prix, and we are well ahead of the lineup block at 6 a.m. Eastern tomorrow morning. So, if you're watching this live, would love to see your questions and go over your lineups with you over the next hour. But if you're seeing us on demand, feel free to leave some of your questions either in the chat of this YouTube video or in our fan ant base. Rob and I will be in and out between now and tomorrow morning. We can answer some of those questions for you offline too. Rob, what have you thought about some of these morning sessions, and are we getting closer to what our final lineups will look like?
Yeah, I think we are definitely. I think as we glean from China and Miami earlier in the season, that sprint qualifying really does hold a lot more value than typically an ordinary practice session would. So I think with the information we have so far, maybe a couple of different surprises for sure. But I think from what we know, uh, it certainly helps my decision making a little bit more as we get closer to the deadline tomorrow morning.
Absolutely. And that's a good lead in to our fifth gear Garms question for this week is who do you think the better 2x DRS boost option is going to be, Max or Lando? I can tell you, looking at the responses so far, the response has been overwhelmingly for Lando. So feel free to answer this however you'd like. Is it who's going to specifically score more points, or does Lando enable some budget somewhere else in your lineup, and so he's the better team player for you? So let us know if you're in the chat how you voted and what some of your criteria were for that. Right. I see Mike and Luke in the chat. Hey, guys. Welcome aboard. Rob, maybe we can load up a screen share and start going over some of the free practice data and what we learned from the early session.
Yeah, definitely a great idea. Let's take a look at these practice times because I missed free practice and I caught snippets of sprint qualifying. So I got a bit of catching up to do now and later in the day too.
No worries. No worries. I can walk you through some of it. So there was a little bit of drama about 2/3 of the way through the session because Max was stopped on track with a reported engine problem. And so you and I have been talking all week about how he's gone through a lot of his engine parts. Maybe this is the weekend he already takes an engine penalty, but they were able to start him back up pretty quickly after the red flag. So I think Max is in the clear, but boy, it's getting closer and closer that he could be taking that penalty. So that was the big drama. And then a lot of activity in the last minute of the session, and Russell and where is he? Russell and Lando were both on flyers at the end of the session. Lando took a trip into the gravel, and George got caught up in some traffic. So their times probably would have been a bit better had they completed their lap on the pace that they were on. So the final classification for FP1 was a little funky, but overall, it's shaping up in the early session to be Red Bull, McLaren, Ferrari looking promising at first, but then once we get into the sprint qualifying, you'll see that they've dropped off a bit again.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's a good sign for people that were maybe having a bit of cold feet on Ferrari heading into the weekend to see Charles and Carlos, even though Charles didn't get that time in at the end of sprint qualifying, to see them back towards the top. So if there are other probably more pressing fires in your team to put out, I think Ferrari could well be a hold as a result of that.
And let's take a look at some of the sprint qualifying results. A lot of activity again in the last minute or so of some of these sessions. We'll start at the bottom here, where probably the biggest news here is for the first time ever as teammates, Logan Sargent defeated Alex Albon in qualifying session. So he made it out of SQ1. Other than that, it typically, pretty normal participants falling out of SQ1 with double Sauber, Alex Albon, and a Haas.
I know that it really doesn't affect our fantasy scores at all before the deadline, but isn't it funny that Logan beats his teammate and still somehow ends up with a DNF assigned to his time on the timing chart? So
Yeah.
I don't think that really worries me too much for people who do own him, and I don't have him in my team anymore, thank goodness. But that DNF merchant title of his is probably not going away anytime soon.
The poor guy. Yeah, what happened in SQ2, he posted a lap. It looked like it was a flyer. It got deleted at the end. He just didn't have a time to make it quite right. So he didn't bin it off or anything. He just had a track limits error. So I'm really excited when we bring in Terry later to talk about some of the changes to this circuit to reduce the track limit penalties. We're going to walk through some of the history of how this race last season was such a mess with respect to those track limits violations. And then we'll talk about what that means for us looking ahead to this year. Moving up to the middle of the grid here, an appearance by both Aston Martins, a little bit low for Fernando Alonso compared to what I'm thinking. And it looks like RB is still trying to dial in those upgrades they introduced last week. They had told us after Spain, we threw everything at the wall, trying to see what sticks. We know we're not going to be super fast and it looks like they haven't quite figured it out yet.
No, not quite. I mean, I was holding some hope they'd be able to turn it around after how disappointing Spain was for them, but it's kind of a weird situation for Ricardo and Sonoda in terms of F1 fantasy, because you want to be going for those drivers that are either qualifying well at the back or that are sitting around P9 to P11 that have good race pace, and it's kind of no man's land for them. So it's a bit of a difficult case to make to have either of them. And I honestly 2 weeks ago had thought I would be having Sonoda for Austria, but that looks highly unlikely now.
I totally agree. And this is a circuit with 3 DRS zones. It was a top 5 overtaking track each of the last 2 seasons. We're trying to find these optimal drivers that'll take advantage of it, because it'll be a secret source of points. Yuki's usually among those top drivers, but I'm nervous that he's not quite dialed in with it yet. And then as we move into those that made it into SQ3, another double Alpine in the top 10. So clearly they're starting to find something here. My early take from way back when is starting to manifest, with Alpine regularly challenging for points. And you had hinted at this earlier. Charles Leclerc had the issue right at the end. They had all queued up coming out of the pit lane. He pulled over to let some drivers pass. I think Terry said it was a suspected brake issue that they repaired, but Charles couldn't get that flying lap in SQ3, so he's going to start at the bottom of the top 10.
Yeah, not a great result for the sprint race for Charles. I do think he had a bit of pace. Like him and Carlos both showed it throughout sprint qualifying. So I do wonder if it is just a red herring and they bounce back in actual qualifying tomorrow. But not a great sign for his owners. And it is, again, without pit stops, going to be harder to make more of those passes against those better teams. So he probably becomes a very easy casualty for me and my team this week. But you mentioned double Alpine. Great to see the ascendancy from those guys. And we talked about them in our earlier show in the week. So I do have high hopes for at least one of the 2 drivers finishing in the points in the sprint race.
Excuse me. This speaks to a point you made earlier this week, Rob, about how on these high finish tracks, your tier C drivers tend to not get a lot of value gain, because the average points, they fall well below what we need to gain value. When you have drivers like the double Alpines at the top of tier C, they're the most likely to gain some of that value because they're flirting with the top 10. I really like both of them as value plays this week.
It is interesting that, though, and I completely put this to the back of my mind since Miami, but that the C tier drivers, you're right, are at more of a risk of going down in price on those lower DNF tracks, but also on the sprint race weekends. What we learned in Miami was that some of those backmarker drivers that start P18 to P20 can sometimes outscore the drivers that finish around 6th to 10th, because there's only a couple of points on offer for those placement finishes. And you're probably not making, for someone like Sergio Perez, more than 1 or 2 overtakes at most, given the caliber of drivers ahead of them. So I wonder if we do see the likes of Zhou, Albon, Bottas score anywhere between 4 and 7, 4 and 8 points, and someone like Sergio Perez or Esteban Ocon emerge with maybe 1 or 2 points from the sprint.
And I've got to say it because I think some people might still have PTSD from this. In Miami, that sprint race, you had the Norris-Stroll collision. I know a lot of people went from the highs of Limitless in China to 2xing Lando at the start of his streak, only to basically have a triple DNF coming out of the first turn of the Miami sprint. So you could have an incident like that, but it's typically pretty rare at a track like this because you have such a long run down to turn 1, low DNS historically. So fingers crossed it. I'm hoping that I'm bored tomorrow because that means the fantasy team's doing all right.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
And then moving to the top here, it looks like it's pretty clear that the salad dressing starting to separate with Red Bull and McLaren as the 1 and 2 constructors. And as you mentioned at the top of the show, Rob, just a matter of where do Mercedes and Ferrari slot in. And this is a 2-part question. What do we do with the individual drivers? And then what do we do with the constructors as potential value gaining tier B constructors?
Yeah, it is a tricky one. I think Mercedes are just delivering consistency, and that's what you want to see from a constructor at the very least. So I do think it makes for them a slightly easier hold than Ferrari right now. But given how good McLaren in particular look at both drivers inside the top 3, it's also a session where time management is less important. And we know Oscar has struggled with that a little bit in the past. So without the teams needing to stop unless, of course, we see a safety car or any other extenuating circumstances. I think McLaren are on for the highest scoring constructor in at least the sprint race.
That makes a lot of sense. Quick note, because I love sharing good things about my boy Lewis. This would be his 300th race with a points finish if he finishes in the top 10. It's the most all time by a very wide margin. So I hope another feather in the cap for Lewis comes this week. Also, a quick note, because we see Verstappen here, P1 for the sprint, and it's typically a harbinger of things to come for the Grand Prix. P1 has won 5 of the last 6 races here. So it's typically a high likely outcome that whoever gets pole will win. So something to keep in mind if Max is looking good tomorrow too.
No driver of the day in the sprint race, but there is 5 points on offer for the fastest lap. So something to keep in mind there. I do think Max is probably, as you say, Adam, the favorite to win the sprint race, but Sunday is a completely different kettle of fish, because that's when driver of the day comes in. And as Mike in the chat mentioned, the DNF merchant, the driver of the day merchant, Lando Norris, is probably in the box seat for those points too.
That's a great point. Yeah, as people are considering Max versus Lando, both for our question and in their lineups, seeing Lando in the top 2 there, it's basically a cincher that he's going to get it as long as he stays on the track for the weekend. It looks like I've struck a nerve with Mike and Leaps Frog, who both had Lando in Miami. Sorry about that. Better days are ahead. All right. I'm going to do a quick refresh on fantasy tools, because I saw before I came on here that Ryder was prepping a sim. I just want to make sure we don't miss anything. Nothing yet. We're still on Spain. All right. So perhaps what we can do then is go into some of the lineup reviews and see if we can get some of these out. The first one is from Feint, and Feint is giving us 4 teams here. The current team looks to be loaded with Mercedes. Option 2 is a Verstappen build, basically getting out of the Mercedes and bringing in Verstappen with midfield drivers. Option 3 is a Lando Lewis build. And then option 4 is just leaning even heavier into Mercedes and bringing McLaren instead of Ferrari as the second constructor.
I think Feint actually might have sent me this on Twitter, and I'm trying to recall what the question was, if it was budget building or point scoring focused. But I think my answer might have been one of the bottom 2 teams because of a little bit of McLaren coverage.
Yes, I'm tempted to say the bottom left. And this was probably submitted before some of this morning's festivities. I would switch the 2X to Lando, because right now it's on Lewis.
Yeah, I think it probably was where my thought process landed. It's essentially Lando, Logan, and Ferrari versus George, Zhou, and McLaren. So I think it'll be pretty close, but I think that driver of the day upside that Lando does have is certainly compelling for that bottom left team.
And something that you had mentioned earlier this morning, unfortunately, if you're running Sargent, you can basically bank a -2, -3 for the sprint, because he made it into SQ2. So something to keep in mind, but really, as long as he finishes the race, I think you'll more or less be okay.
Yeah.
All right. Moving down to the second team, NBZ, our contest winner from last week. So let's look at these options here. A couple of Verstappen builds with Ferrari or McLaren. And I'll tell you, considering the midfield options are only slightly different between the left and the right, I like that right team with McLaren.
I do too. I think just from what we've seen so far, Oscar and Lando are too good to look past. So right team for me too.
I like it. And I don't know if you can see their team names. They're playoffs of some of our favorite turns. So there's Eau Rouge and 130 Arg. So I like your team names, BC. All right, moving on now to our third person. This is J Ho. So we have a now or potentially a later team. They're thinking about using the no negative. And the question is it worth bringing Lando in for the sake of also having Sargent potentially weighing your team down?
I mean, both teams have both Sauber drivers, so I think if you're using the no negative for for the team on the right, you may as well use it for the team on the left. I will say that I probably prefer the right team only because Logan doesn't seem to be as concerning for me this week, and I think Lando is much better than Leclerc at that spot. But I wouldn't. I think use the 2x. Use the no negative unless it's for more than one driver or you're trying to counteract rain or something like that. But I wouldn't use the no negative just because of Logan Sargent.
I agree for all the same reasons. I think Lando versus Charles, it's a big swing to Lando for this week. I also, while I recommend no negative on a sprint weekend because you have 2 events to lose positions or potentially DNF in, this is such a low DNF circuit. And the next sprints aren't until October, but they're much higher DNF circuits. And I think you might have that odd chance that a driver DNFs or loses places between the events a little bit more than you would here, even though it's sort of a given that Sargent would cost you 2 or 3 points this week.
I'm just glad we've already used it so we don't have to worry about what could have been if we have DNFs in our team. We just have to, it is what it is, and live with that. So
Rob, you've used your autopilots. You've used your autopilot too, so you can watch me stress out over when or if I'm ever going to use it. I still rue the day that I passed up on that a few races ago.
Yeah, it's all good. I'm sure there'll be plenty more opportunities. Oh God, this is a lot.
All right, we got 5 options. My goodness. All right, so the original from Spain is triple Ferrari. So Arkan has the same sort of urgency that I have. I think we can look over a few of them because the first column, you've got an RB and a Haas constructor, which is already a non-starter for me. I'd almost rather keep the triple Ferrari than flirt with some of that. Yep. And then a lot of people. So let's stop and talk about the Alpine because a lot of folks have asked me, could I use the 3x DRS boost this week with Verstappen and Norris, clear 1 and 2? I've got a significantly downgraded constructor to Alpine. My take on this is, even though the 1 and 2 drivers are super clear, I feel like if you just take that little bit of patience, grow your budget to the second half of the year, you won't have to skimp on the constructors. You can have it all. So why rush it now? But I want to get your take on it, Rob.
No, I completely agree. I think we've still got 3 sprint races to use the 3X chip, and by the time we get to Circuit of the Americas, we probably will have enough to field a Max Verstappen, Lando Norris, Ferrari, Mercedes, or something like that. So I found it hard to make the case for it now when you're essentially hypothetically scoring an additional 40 points if you wait later in the season. So I'm aligned with you on that.
Yeah, and to expand upon my case on this a little bit is these better constructors are more likely to get the teammate points of getting both drivers into Q3. You can see Alpine is right on that fringe. It could be P10, P11, then all of a sudden you're missing some points. And then the pit stop points, I think Alpine has had 1 bonus the whole season. Mostly been monopolized by Red Bull, Ferrari, McLaren, with a couple of Mercedes in between.
Yep.
All right. Moving on down here to our good friend Mike. Let's see, what does Mike have here?
I think Mike's been deliberating about this for some time. From what he's saying on Twitter.
Starting with Lando and Charles with Ferrari, the easy pivot is just to move into Lewis. And then the -10 would be completely get out of Charles and Ferrari and bring in Red Bull. Me, having been on the wrong side of Ferrari for 2 weeks in a row, I'm going emotional and saying, get all the way out of Ferrari and take the penalty. But will cooler heads prevail with Rob? Let's see.
I don't mind it. I think all 3 teams look excellent, if I'm being completely honest. I like Mercedes at the moment. I think Lando in all of them is an excellent 2X option and is an easy hold. I think the one thing to say for the team on the left is your budget gain probably isn't going to be quite as much compared to the team in the middle or on the left because you've got 2 A-tier assets in Lando and Red Bull. But I do think you are compensating for maybe some lost budget or some lesser budget by going for a high scoring constructor and probably what should be the highest scoring driver on the weekend as well.
That's a great point. So Mike, maybe you can answer that in the chat too. Are you leaning a little bit more toward points or a little bit toward cost cap? Because I know in some of our private chats with some of our listeners, we have people that are this close from affording that next tier of things, and so they really want to focus on cost cap game. But for me, I've lost some points the last few weeks believing in Ferrari, so I want to be just raw points and then figure out cost cap later.
Definitely. I think to answer his question of Ocon or Magnussen, I think it's, to me, clear Magnussen is the better option of the two. Terrible qualifier. I think he's got the third lowest qualifying position of all drivers and is in the top 2 for overtakes and positions gained this season, and has also gone up the most of all C-tier drivers. So Magnussen kind of is an easy decision for me. I know I've only got a few, probably 5 to 10 minutes left before I have to leave and Terry will take my place. But I was hoping we could cover off a couple of questions in the chat. So
let's do it.
I don't leave you and Terry with the burden of answering all them with 30 minutes to go.
Absolutely. Just a second ago, you were touching on the subject of Narbita Yar's question of, do we wild card out of triple Ferrari? That's where I'm currently leaning. I'm in that scenario where I've got all 3 Ferrari assets. I carried over a transfer and I'm this close, but I think I'm going to need a -10 or -20 because I've got Sargent too. So right now I'm leaning toward wild card.
Yeah. So does that mean... Yeah, because, sorry, correct me if I'm wrong. Does that mean that's potentially on the table for you this week as well?
Yeah. I'm at this point where I have triple Ferrari and Sargent. I want all of them out. But then to do that, I think I have to shuffle a little bit in the midfield. And by the time I do that, I'm looking at like 5 transfers. And even with the free one, I think I'm a bit caught out. So I want to try to cover. I need some Lando coverage. And now I'm in between. Do I want McLaren and Mercedes or McLaren and Red Bull, depending on how I want the rest of my team to flow out.
It's exciting. It's exciting when the wild card's on the table.
Yes, there'll be a little bit of anxiety for all of you in about 20 minutes as I start playing around with my team.
Foin has asked, as he can't run a kind of a double A/B tier lineup to go with either Norris or Verstappen and then upgrade Ferrari with McLaren. What's your take on running just one premium driver as opposed to 2 this weekend?
The way I've thought about this week is I recommend, if you're going to run one, try to cover it off with the other's constructor. So Lando, Red Bull, or Max McLaren. Be pretty tough to cover to have all of the constructors and all the drivers anyway. So that's how I think you can have the best of both worlds. That if Lando with driver of the day, maybe he sneaks a sprint fastest lap and then he outscores Verstappen, you've got coverage of him as the driver or as part of the constructor, and then vice versa for Max.
Nice one. I think we might have missed a couple of questions earlier. Wesley's asked, what's your take on the 2 Mercedes drivers, George versus Lewis? I think my answer's, because I've been running Lewis, is pretty biased, but I'd like to get your take as a Silver Arrows fan.
Not a problem. I think so. Lewis was actually flying in free practice on very, very old hards. And I think he's looking a little bit better than even we saw in sprint qualifying. So if you have the money to afford Lewis, I would go with it. If it's really just a matter of one or the other. If the difference between George and Lewis in price, which I think is still fairly close, if that's the difference between a big asset change, the Ferrari constructor to a McLaren or something else for you, then feel free to go with Russell, but I'm with you, Rob. Lean toward Lewis.
Nice. One or the other, Hulk or Zhou? Had to choose. This is a question from Jess.
It's pretty much a coin flip because they're both sitting at the bottom of the sprint, and then it's just a matter of, do you think they're going to do it again in the Grand Prix? I guess I'd lean toward Zhou a little bit. This is around the time of the year where he starts doing all that overtake magic, but it's not with so much confidence that if you went the other way, I'd be upset with you.
I think it's pretty even between the two because the race pace of that Haas is so good that if Hulk is kind of sitting around P10, he'll probably finish around there, and Zhou will go out, first qualifying session. So he's, as you say, leaning on overtakes to boost his points. But if you are starting from the very back, you're bound to pick up a couple of positions gained at the very least.
Good. Christopher has a question. Since the C tier is a crapshoot, what do you think of Red Bull, McLaren, Norris with Tsunoda, Gasly, Hulk, K-Mag? So basically trying to get the cream of the crop of tier C with just the single premium driver.
I like it.
I'm fine with that. Yeah, it goes
Yeah.
back to our point from a second ago of covering off Norris with the Red Bull constructor.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. No, I like that a lot. I think I mean, I really thought heading into the weekend I'd have some Red Bull, but I really don't know yet. I thought I'd have Max 2 weeks ago, and I'm certainly not leaning towards having Max anymore. So the Red Bull constructor is really my only other candidate to cover in. But I also want McLaren, so it's at least a -10 if I do go the McLaren Red Bull route.
It seems like every week I come up with some statistic to convince me to go with Ferrari, either a sim, be it Rider Sims or the F1, the race pace sims, or something from Formula Data Analysis. This week, I'm not listening to any of it. It's going to be Red Bull and McLaren and maybe a little Mercedes coverage.
Nice. All right. Okay, why don't we answer Rafa's question, and then I will have to jet. Unfortunately, I feel like I missed last week, or we missed last week's stream, and then I think I missed the one before that, and I'm only on for half of this one. So hopefully for Silverstone, I'll be there for the full hour, and it's going to also be at a much better time. But why don't we answer Rafa's question, and then I'll let Terry jump in, and I'll step out.
Sure. I just want to make sure I'm seeing the same question. Can you talk a look ahead into the next 2 races?
Yeah, which drivers could thrive? I assume we're talking about Austria Silverstone, or are we going to talk about Silverstone Hungary?
Well, that's a good question. Well, we at least the one common denominator is Silverstone. So if we look ahead at that, this will be a very interesting inflection point because Alpine said last week we're worried that we don't have a pipeline of upgrades coming soon, whereas most of these UK-based teams are bringing upgrades for Silverstone. You have RB that's just this close to fine-tuning their upgrades to the point of taking over. So I'm worried that Alpine are a good play this week, next week, and they may turn into a pumpkin shortly after that. So ride Ocon and Gasly as much as you can, and then keep that eye out for Tsunoda and Ricciardo. 250 Grand Prix starts for Ricciardo this weekend.
Could be his last, from what some people are saying.
What a crazy week.
I think the next 2 races is going to be a little trickier to gauge than, say, a sprint race weekend, because everyone kind of does pile into those more powerful, I think, load their team top heavy and then kind of fill out the rest with what they can afford. But I do think Silverstone's going to be an interesting one. The home race for Lewis, George, Lando, all drivers, which are in very competitive cars. And I know Lando is single-handedly dominating that driver of the day. I hate talking about it because it comes up so much, but I do think those 3 drivers will all be kind of favorites heading into the weekend for that award. And Lewis hasn't won for a couple of years at his home race. I know he's probably out to feature more on the podium. So yeah, I think Lewis has got the momentum at the moment. I think he's going to be one to watch continuing into Austria and Silverstone.
Agreed. I like Lewis and Lando a lot for next week. And that might be part of the consideration here, setting that team up so that you're not completely undoing it for next weekend. So good question there, Rafa.
Cool. All right. Well, I might have to split, unfortunately, Adam. I sometimes resent having work on the same day of these streams, but it was a short but sweet 30 minutes. I'll let you and Terry steer the ship for the remainder of the stream. And thanks again. Good luck, everyone, this weekend.
Thanks so much, Rob. And Rob's going to be posting his content for the rest of the night and tomorrow with his team and other advice. So keep an eye out for him because I'm sure he's got some good advice on the way. Awesome. So now we'll bring in the man himself back from his weekend at the Spanish Grand Prix. It's the one and only Terry from F1 Coffee Corner. Hey, Terry.
Hey, sorry, I'm not as, you can have to make do with me instead of Rob, so.
Hey, that's okay. That's okay. We have a whole different dynamic. Let's have some fun. First off, how was the Spanish Grand Prix? Did you have a great time?
I had an amazing time. It was absolutely out of this world. Wasn't very relaxing, I must admit. It wasn't a relaxing getaway, but it was a fantastic getaway. So yeah, no, it was really good.
Excellent. Now I want to put you to work and talk about these changes to the circuit, because last year there were over 1,200 recorded track limits violations. We had Tsunoda and Hamilton get penalties during the race. Afterwards, Aston Martin protested the race result and they gave out another 12 penalties. Esteban Ocon ended up with 30 seconds of post-race penalties. So the whole thing was just really turned upside down and made for a disappointing end to the weekend. Could you talk us through some of the changes they've made to the circuit to limit it? And have you seen the effectiveness we were expecting through the first 2 sessions?
Yeah, so first and foremost, I think the FIA actually deserve a bit of credit. We don't normally give them credit. I know we gang upon them quite a lot, but they have made quite a few changes. So we've got these gravel traps, mainly on turns 9, 10, the final 2 corners, which are the big culprits. We've also got some of the curbs slightly moved as well. So I don't know how much you know about the curbs. They're basically 2 meters wide, which is the width of a Formula One car. So they're not, it wouldn't have been enough to leave the curbs. So they've actually painted half of the curbs to make the track wider and to introduce it to the gravel track. So they've done quite a bit of work on it. They've also introduced some blue lines. I don't know if you've seen those on Twitter. So the blue lines are there because the white line was on a red and white curb, which if you're trying to look at track limits isn't very helpful. So you'll notice there's this thin blue line that goes round. And basically if you can see the wheel on that blue line, it's off track limits. And they're also using AI, which obviously that blue line makes for a lot of changes to that as well. It can be noticed a lot easier. The one thing I will say about AI doesn't delete the lap time. What it does, it automatically flags it for a review. So we're not at a stage where AI is deleting it. It just flags it for that further look at, which is back in Geneva, back at race control. In terms of how it works, I was just looking, we only had 8 deleted lap times in the sprint qualifying. So, you know, it clearly is working from that point of view. That's a lot less than what we had before. So we haven't heard drivers moan about it. We haven't heard a lot of sort of, you know, they're having problems with it. So it seems like, touch wood, that actually it's having the desired effect on it. So like I say, you know, these gravel traps are temporary because we know that MotoGP don't like them. So they want it lifted afterwards. So they're literally going to lift them up after the Grand Prix weekend, fill them all back in for the motorsport. So it's a good idea. It's good to see him doing something. Good to see him really proactive with it. And it's actually really good to see some technology being used as well with the AI. So quite excited in that front.
Let me ask you about the track limits violations that we saw in sprint qualifying. Obviously much lower, like you said. Are they in the normal places? Like despite some of the curb changes, despite some of the gravel trap changes, are drivers still finding themselves off track? Or have they found new ways to violate the track limits?
They're actually in turns 1, 6, and 9. So nothing in turn 10, the final corner, which is interesting. Turn 1 would have just been drivers going slightly wide on that corner there. So there was a couple of instances where drivers went wide. So yeah, it seems like the corners where we had the big problems are working well in terms of the gravel trap and the moving and the curb. So definitely looks promising. Like I say, the problem is when they go off, it classes as going off the, you know, a track time deleted, doesn't it? So it don't take someone to go wide on a corner. So it definitely wasn't as big a problem what we saw.
It might be too early to ask you this, but we saw 2 mechanical issues in the earlier sessions. There was Max with the power issue in free practice 1, Charles with the number of brake issues or something of that nature in SQ3. Any word on the severity of those issues? Is it something that could come up later in the weekend?
Max, well, his car looks fine. It looks like they just turned it off and back on. Bit of control alt delete, you know, blow in the plug it back in. In terms of engines, we know he's got a problem with his calendar engine. That's what we're hearing a lot about. So he doesn't want to take an engine penalty. So he's only going to take one if he needs one. They're trying to hold off for Spa to take a new engine on that one. So from what I can see in the way he's been running, I don't think it's a problem. I think it was a genuine software glitch that just needed a reboot. That doesn't mean that it can't happen again, of course, but Red Bull don't seem overly concerned about it. Charles was a brake issue. They fixed it. They can do that in the part firme on a like for like. But in terms of the Ferrari performance, it doesn't look as smooth as what it probably has done in the past. And it looks like there's still some problems there since those updates getting it together a bit.
It's a great segue into where I wanted to go with you next, is that Ferrari and Mercedes had been considerations in our lineup for the last few weeks. I've leaned toward Ferrari, but they've seemed to have lost my trust. Is there anything you saw in SQ3? They were relatively close. I think Sainz split the Mercedes, and then Charles obviously had the problem to start P10. Has Ferrari evened things out with Mercedes at all, or should we leave them out of our lineups this week, wait for that trust to build back up come Silverstone and try them again?
I mean, I'll probably wait in terms of updates. So Mercedes brought a beam wing with them to help their downforce, and Ferraris were just cooling loose. So it wasn't anything of any sort of major updates. I think Mercedes has been making this gain over the past few weeks. They've talked about it. They almost slipped under the radar with it, where they introduced the lightweight floor. So it wasn't updated, it was more lightweight. It seems like they've got a handle of the car a lot more since, I'll probably say, Imola onwards, that they seem to seem to have the setup in a lot more in the window. The only thing I will say is Mercedes do well on a Friday. We've seen this before, and then we also see Saturday and into Sunday. So there's going to be a lot of data you can get from the sprint. You can obviously change part firmate after that. I could imagine Ferrari, where they are, certainly Charles is going to run it as a mini test for him to get a lot of data, to get his setup right for qualifying and the race itself, judging from what is he 10th, I believe, in sprint qualifying, top of my head. So I can see them just using that to get as much data as they can ready for the race itself on Sunday. Now that you can make those changes, obviously, which is different to last year.
Rob and I had suggested earlier that RB, they were basically on either side of falling out of SQ1. We suspect that they hadn't totally dialed in some of their upgrades they brought last week. I just want to know what you thought of them. It's Ricciardo's 250th race start. Yuki had been a bit closer to the top 10 in recent races. What's your take on RB as a midfield driver? Are they ready for prime time yet, or should we wait for those upgrades to be dialed in?
I think we need to wait. It's a lot of upgrades all at once, and I think that's the problem with it, because it's which part is not getting the performance they want. So I think they're trying to dial into which part is causing the issue. We've heard Daniel Ricciardo talk about not being too rash and taking them all off, which is what we've had in the past. So I think they've got so much they changed on it. They need to find out exactly what each part is doing and what works with what. So I think they're still experimenting a lot. I think they're still in a phase where actually it's probably not going to be for another couple of races before we, like you say, we start seeing them dialed into getting the true effects of that car. And that might see lots of Alpine jump up ahead of them in the short term. But then I think we're going to get that switch with development where Alpine haven't got anything in the pipeline and RB dialed into theirs. So I think at the moment I'll probably lean more Alpine way, and then probably switch more to RB, sort of Silverstone onwards, Hungary, that side of things, when they've got the data.
It's very validating of what we said earlier, so it's good to hear. And one last midfield team I want to touch on is Aston Martin. Both a bit lower than what we're used to seeing. I think Fernando Alonso's been outspoken in recent weeks about his dissatisfaction with Aston Martin's ability to keep up with the upper part of the field. What's your take on their outlook in these next few races? Are they basically in a holding pattern until their next wave of upgrades?
I think Silverstone is more what they're aiming at. They haven't got nothing for this weekend at all. So like Red Bull, they haven't brought anything, and I'm not seeing anything which makes me convinced that they can dial it out from the setup point of view. It's not a track that's typically been a happy hunting ground for Aston Martin previously anyway. So it's not one where Aston Martin traditionally done well at. So I think that they're probably more looking towards Silverstone and just kind of damage limitation, I'll probably say this weekend.
Sounds good. Terry, before we get back to the chat, was there anything else you wanted to share with our viewers, either upgrades we didn't talk about or any technical considerations that could impact our fantasy lineups?
No, I don't think there's a lot. Like I say, it was light in terms of upgrades as we expected. Teams either rushed them forward for last week or they're holding back until next week. So we're going to see a lot of action on teams who you didn't see updates for in Barcelona. We're going to see that arriving in Silverstone, which is the normal case. In terms of the race itself, we got C3, C4, C5 compound tires. Normally look around a 2-stop race, 20 seconds for a pit stop. Weather doesn't look too bad. I know there's some showers forecast, but it's not. Talking 30%, 40% on Sunday. Not a lot for tomorrow, so I don't think weather's going to play a huge part. But it can catch you out in Austria when it hits over those hills, doesn't it? So it can roll in quicker than expected. But I think as we stand, there's not too much from a technical point of view that is going to change from what we're seeing. And I think with that part firmly change, it allows the drivers and the teams to go back and reset things after the sprint race tomorrow. So that's a big bonus on the teams to get it right for qualifying again.
I didn't even think about the rain that was forecast earlier this week. I hope it blows off, or it's an early morning rain like they've had in some recent races. All right, let's cover back off into the chat here. All right.
Oh.
Mike in the chat says Liam with an exclamation point. I imagine he'd like a few words from you on some of these rumors we're hearing that Daniel Ricciardo could not only be not in the seat next year, he might not last through the summer. What are you hearing about Liam Lawson?
I think a lot of this is because Liam Lawson's got his contract option. So for those who don't know, it was promised last year that Liam would have a seat for next season. That option expires during the summer break. So if Red Bull don't take up that option, he's free to talk to everyone else. The problem that Liam's got is there's not a lot of other seats available from what we're seeing. So I think it's very much a waiting game. I'm not too convinced we won't see Daniel for the rest of this season. I think next season is a huge question mark, but I'm not convinced that they're going to make a change at halfway point. Not yet. I think they would rather give Daniel the season out due to what he brings to the team, and then make a call on it at the end of the season, knowing that Liam hasn't got elsewhere to go. And in fact, they could, of course, sign Liam, box off that sort of chat of him going elsewhere for next season, and keep Daniel for this season as well. So I'm not sold on this one yet in terms of a swap over before the end of the season at all on that.
It's an interesting game of chicken they're playing here, is that the longer they stretch out the Lawson situation, more seats are going to get filled, fewer places for him to go if they opt to stick with Danny for the rest of the year or even into next year. So very interesting to see how this plays out in the coming weeks.
Yeah, I think Liam's a backup for a lot of other teams who have got 1, 2, maybe even 3 options ahead of that. So I think it would take a lot for him to get a drive somewhere else. Unfortunately, not anything to do with talent, so just in the way the chips are falling elsewhere from what we're seeing. And obviously, we've had 2 confirmed already this week as well. So yeah, we're expecting Haas to go next week. With Ollie Behrman due to be announced in the run up to Silverstone. So that'll be one of those seats gone. So Carlos looks like it's going to be after the triple header now, from what we're hearing as well. So they're going to fill it pretty soon. And I think as soon as the Carlos domino falls there, we're going to see it sort of rapidly fill up.
The drivers were not shy on Thursday about saying what Carlos Sainz's decision means to the rest of theirs. I think it was Joe that called him the cork in the bottle.
Yeah.
All right. MB in the chat says, fun stream, guys. Thank you, MB. Do you like Norris, Sainz, Mercedes, Red Bull, or Verstappen, Russell, Mercedes, McLaren? I'm torn. Ooh.
Second one.
Yeah. Yeah. The Sainz bit sticks out to me. I think you could have all of both worlds, potentially Norris, Russell, Mercedes, Red Bull, which I would make peace with. It's the Sainz piece of the first team that I think sticks out to me.
Yeah.
But you were listening to our advice earlier. If you have Norris, cover him off with Red Bull. If you have Verstappen, cover him off with McLaren. So both of those teams listen to that advice, and that'll serve you well. Ooh, Danny in the chat wants to know, what option would you put for Limitless? So I know our producer Elise is talking about Limitless. I was talking to our friend Chris McCarthy, who's covering F2 and F3 this week, about Limitless. For those of you who haven't played it, Rob and I really recommend you do. Our next sprint race isn't until October. So we got a long time until we have a good opportunity to use it again. And we showed some data earlier this week that shows that Limitless is still producing slightly better results than a regular race week. And so Danny suggests Norris, Verstappen, Piastri, Hamilton, Russell, McLaren, and Mercedes. I would recommend, if you have Limitless, let's start with the constructors. Let's do McLaren and Red Bull for the constructors, because even though Checo's a bit of a loose end, the pit stop points for Red Bull are going to be really good. And Verstappen is one of the safest anchors you could have to a constructor. So I'd say McLaren, Red Bull for your constructors. Norris, Verstappen, Piastri, Hamilton, Russell. That looks pretty good. If you snuck Charles Leclerc in as your number 5 driver, that might be okay. And if you're hoping that he gets some overtakes in the sprint and sorts himself out into about P4, P5 for the race. Terry, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would say, if you think that Austria is in a high sort of DNF one, it's certainly not one where a driver will go off and crash too much. So I think Checo is probably, I'm just probably going to jinx it now, aren't I? But yeah, he's on 7th, isn't he? So I think his performance enough will make me lean towards Red Bull for this one here. Definitely.
Now, Matt Gregory in the chat says, thoughts on removing Ferrari, Leclerc, and Yuki to get a piece of Norris, McLaren, and Sargent. So I think the thought here is, are we willing to make the double move from Ferrari to McLaren, but you got to deal with Sargent? Yeah, I'm at peace with that. The difference right now between Norris and Leclerc is pretty significant. And similarly, the difference between McLaren and Ferraris has grown a bit. So as long as Sargent finishes the race, the difference between Yuki pre-RB upgrades working and Sargent's like 5 or 6 points. I'd do it.
Yeah. No, I agree. Like I said, I think Sargent be okay finishing here. Probably jinxing everything now.
Joel wants to know about my thoughts on bringing Davide Valsecchi in as a guest speaker soon. I'd love that. He's in the
Yeah,
lead.
definitely.
I have occasionally called him out on my Monday F1 Live updates. He hasn't taken the bait on it yet, but my goodness, I'd love to have him on.
Yeah, feel free to try and call him out yourselves as well. Let's get him on there. We're just spamming.
Yes, let's spam him. We did that with Will Buxton and got this close earlier this year. Let's just keep spamming them all.
Absolutely.
Jack says, good week for Limitless. Yes. His second question, Max is the 2X. I'm seeing this both ways, including the previous question on Limitless. Max or Lando is the 2X. Really, I think what you're banking on is Max probably winning the sprint, possibly winning the Grand Prix, Lando finishing P2 in both and catching driver of the day. And then it's a matter of who gets fastest lap to break the tie. They're that close.
Yeah.
I guess I'd lean slightly toward Max, but Lando, I mean, if he gets driver of the day and the sprint fastest lap, he gets him by a point or two. All right. This is a good time. Our fan and producers are reminding me, don't forget to enter the giveaway. Max versus Lando. This is a good time to bring up that question again. Head on over to our fan amp base and let us know who is the best 2X driver for this week.
Ooh, that's a tough one. I think it's going to be close.
I think so. Let's see. Harrison wants to know worth a -10 to swap Albon for Ocon. Seems safer for points and budget building. Okay. So I think we're trying to see, is Ocon going to score 10 points more than Albon this week? I don't think the points are going to work out, but I think the budget building would. Like, I think Albon is starting lower, Ocon starting higher, where I think you might see a few more points out of Alex, but Ocon, the safer tier C asset to gain in budget. So this goes back to the question of which do you prefer this week, a few more points or a little extra budget? I'd leave that bit up to you. Good. MB would like to remind us not to jinx Sargent anymore. Sorry. Sargent had his first, for anyone who missed the beginning of the show, it's his first ever qualifying ahead of Alex Albon. So I'll end on a good note for him.
And he was cleared of parking falsely that David Coulthard accused him of last week as well. If you saw that clip as well.
Oh, was that the Mercedes that he had parked right up against the bollard or something?
It wasn't Logan Sargent's car. He was driving a black Mercedes, not a white one. So David Coulthard got that completely wrong. I know Logan got a lot of flack for that when it wasn't even his car, bless him.
No more Logan slander.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Does he choose from Mercedes or Ferrari? I actually switched mine out for Mercedes. So that might give you, that's certainly my view. I switched Ferrari out for Mercedes for this weekend.
I'd recommend the same.
Yeah, just on a personal, that was mine.
And admittedly, I've had 2 weeks in a row of Ferrari burning me, so I'm leaning a little more emotional than logical on just completely disavowing Ferrari. So that's my background on it. Let's see. Worth a -10 to switch out Ferrari and Mercedes with Red Bull and McLaren. This is from Joe. Joe, I would wonder if you're making that switch, you might have left a lot of money on the table with the first team, or you're making some moves somewhere else. Because the Red Bull and McLaren are much more expensive than Ferrari and Mercedes.
Yeah.
So I would, maybe if you follow up with if there are other moves you're making, or if you really just have the money and it's just a matter of the points, Red Bull and McLaren should definitely cover Ferrari and Mercedes by 10 or more points. So if it's literally just that for a -10, I support you. All right. So Christopher wants to know, does having Norris or Max with McLaren or Red Bull, that cover off we've been talking about throughout the show, put you in a bad spot from a budget gain standpoint? Potentially. But what would caution too is that Norris over the last few weeks has outgained Verstappen and the Ferrari assets despite being a tier A. Same thing with McLaren over Ferrari and Red Bull. So the two McLaren tier A assets have been better from a budget game perspective. And so I think if you can find the right tier B and tier C drivers, they'll get you the 0.5 and $1 million increases. But Norris getting you consistently 0.2, 0.3 is not nothing from the top of your team.
Yeah. Lando Red Bull or Max McLaren? I've got Max McLaren in mine.
6 of one, half dozen the other
Yeah,
for
I
me.
don't think there's a lot. I don't think
There's
a lot
no
between
wrong
the two.
answers to this, Julian. I lean Max McLaren like Terry, but if you said Lando, Red Bull, I wouldn't argue with you.
And only more because I prefer Oscar to Checo. He's probably why I've lent more McLaren way than that side. I think there'd be more of a chance of Oscar pulling off a surprise than Checo pulling off a surprise.
We've got a bunch more lineups in the chat. I'm gonna fly through some of these here. This is our friend Luke. He is in my camp of the wild card as well. This is basically Red Bull and a sturdier midfield versus McLaren and Mercedes. Lando at the top of each team. I'm slightly happier with the team on the left because I'm so into Alpine.
Yeah.
We'll be fine with the Haas drivers, and Red Bull will be a pretty serious anchor.
Yeah, I would go with that. And to be fair, the Haas drivers qualifying quite low, like say, there's a potential they might gain some points with some overtakes. They're normally quite quick on a race pace, aren't they? So
look at Terry. We're on the first half of the year, and he is just mastering the fantasy game. This is wonderful. All right, this is Leapfrog, Norris, Hamilton, McLaren, and Mercedes. This is a team that's done very well these last few weeks. If you had this duo over the Ferraris, it was something like 2.5 to 3 million in additional budget you've gained just in the last month. So I'd keep rolling with this. And you got Gasly. Gasly's on 3 straight top 10 finishes on the season, 4 straight top 10 finishes at the Red Bull Ring. He loves it here.
What are the options instead of Joe with that one?
Ooh, that's a good question. You see, he has 2.9 million left here, so
yeah,
potentially you can get yourself into to Ocon,
yeah,
or Magnussen.
That's probably the only change I would make with that amount of budget left. I would probably look at just swapping Joe out, keeping the others, but maybe swapping Joe out because I'm not convinced on Sauber's pace or strategy this weekend, to be honest. So that's my only sort of advice on that one.
I like it. All right. The next lineups are from a very D&D themed name here, Frosted Cyber Dragon. I like it. So this is similar to some of the other ones we've seen here. This is Red Bull McLaren with Max versus Mercedes McLaren and Lando. Ooh, you've got this lineup sneaks Norris in. Norris with Russell.
And what's that? Mercedes McLaren, is it?
This looks like the option on the left, a little bit better for points. Option on the right, a little bit better for budget.
Yeah.
I think Russell has the best chance of getting that $500,000 to $1 million with a top 4 or 5 finish this weekend. But then also I very much trust Max and Red Bull this week. Like you could get probably 180 points out of just Max, Red Bull, McLaren. So I just a matter of points versus cost cap at this point. All right. And then we saw Harrison in the chat earlier. Let's see. Did we cover off his question here? Yes. Again, different flavors of Verstappen and then which constructor pairing. Yeah. If it's just a matter of which one, yeah. I prefer Red Bull here. All right. Bobby, this is a Lando and Fernando with Mercedes and McLaren versus Lando and Lewis with Mercedes and Ferrari. Oh boy. Alonso's been rough, but Ferrari's been rougher. Do I have to pick one of these? I would suggest divesting out of Alonso in the first lineup, upgrading Sargent, getting yourself into more Alpine, because I think you can get close because it's 21 million with Alonso and Sargent. The 2 Alpines cost 10 and 9.6. Yeah, you could do double Alpine in the first team instead of Alonso and Sargent. I think that makes it a lot happier.
Yeah, I switched into double Alpine for this weekend.
Good. All right, we are out of lineups or critiques. So if we want, we can start a little of my lineup anxiety. You can see what I've started with here. Thank goodness for Esteban Ocon and that resurgence from Alpine, because these Ferraris have really let me down. My budget, I believe at last check was 117.3. So somewhat average here. I think I'm looking to start with Lando, Red Bull, McLaren. So really cover off Lando. And then what can I do with? Let's see, how much do I have left? 17 million left for the last two spots. So I think I'd have to go.
Oh.
This feels nice to me that I've got a pretty powerful top three, double Alpine. Who knows what Hulkenberg and Joe can do from the overtake standpoint? Terry, what are some of your initial thoughts?
Yeah, no, I think it's quite similar to what I've got, but I went Mercedes rather than Red Bull, just to be a bit more budget on the ones. I'm just seeing what I've got actually.
How did you? Yeah, once you get your team up, I'd love to see how you distributed that extra money going from Red Bull to Mercedes.
Yeah, so I've got Max, Hulkenberg, Bottas, Gasly, Ocon, and then Mercedes and McLaren. So I had to use free transfers, so I was a little bit limited on what I did with it. Because I used obviously wildcard earlier on in the season, so I couldn't pivot away too much without taking penalties. So I had free transfers to make those, so that's what I did to get over onto that side. So
let me ask you I'm going to ask you a question for my benefit. I can afford Albon here over Joe. What do you see from Alex this weekend?
I would take Alex.
Yeah?
Yeah. I also think he'll make places up as well from where he is.
I like it. Just doing a quick stroll here. I can get from Gasly to Magnussen. I'm not sure I love that. I can get from Gasly to Ricardo. I'm not sure I love that.
No.
This is looking pretty good. I would need my wild card because I've basically just nuked half my team to make this happen. But I'm pretty much committed to wild card this weekend. It's going to take a lot to get out of triple Ferrari and Sargent.
Yeah, I think I was only lucky. I was only left with Ferrari constructors, so it was quite easy to pivot out of it. I'd already pivoted out over the last couple of weeks. So
good. Let's see.
Do you see that question, Adam, from F1 Fancy Pitbull about driver of the day in the chat?
Oh, let me get there now. Would love to talk to you guys about this driver of the day exploit. If ever F1 does not contact me, it's only fair we do this as a community. So Rob has been very outspoken about driver of the day and some of its shortcomings. It's become a popularity contest to the point where the best driver isn't always getting the award. And as happy as I am for some of this resurgence from Lando, he has 9 driver of the days.
Yeah.
And since going back to last season. So last week you had Max in a slower car dominating. It was an incredible run for him. Lewis's first podium of the season. He didn't get it. Lando dropped from P1 to P2 when he did get it. It tells you kind of all you need to know about some of the issues there. So now for the rest of this season, I think we need to exploit it and get into these popular drivers like a Lando, or if Charles and Carlos start turning things around, and then hope that some of the shine comes off of Lando in the next few weeks and people are sick of voting for him.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, I do think Silverstone might produce a different outcome. Remains to be seen. Maybe that might be the change, but that depend on performance as well. When that's the thing. I do think if we get like you said earlier, I think Lewis resurgent, Mercedes resurgent might tip the favour that way.
Bridget wants to know which C tier constructor do I think will do Des. Oh, Bridget, don't pick a C tier constructor, because then you're messing around with. Let's see, who would that leave us with? Aston Martin and below.
Yeah.
If I have to answer this, I would say Alpine over RB, Aston Martin, and Haas, but I really don't like those options. I would recommend either double tier B. Obviously, a tier A and a tier B are best. I'm rolling with 2 tier A's and a softer midfield, but I would try to stick with at least 2 tier B's if you can. All right. Matt in the chat says I can afford Max, Merc, and Red Bull, but that means Gasly, Bottas, Sargent, Hulk, and a -10. Ooh, Matt, I wonder what you're starting with that you need to take the extra move for the -10. Ooh, I lost Terry. It's all right. Well, I'll keep muscling through. Oh, there he is. Yeah, Matt, let us know if we drop the recording in a little bit. Feel free to put it in the comments of the YouTube video, and we'll circle back and see what you started with, just to see what that last move is.
Yeah.
Ferrari to Mercedes worth the -10? For me, yes.
Yeah.
Mia wants to know best limitless team. As a reminder, on the limitless, Red Bull, McLaren, Max, Lando, at least Lewis, if not Lewis and George. And then that last spot would be a combination of Piastri, one of the Ferraris, whichever one feels best to you. All right, Terry, we've got to pick a contest winner.
Let's go for it.
All right, let's get the...
Every week I get disappointed I can't enter this.
Sorry.
I know. It's not one of the perks, is it? Let's be honest.
Same here. The problem is Fifth Gear Garms knows that we will buy their stuff all the time because we
Absolutely
love their stuff. So perhaps it's not for us.
We're sat here with the various posters and...
Before I hit the spin, this is a good time to bring up that next week we're going to have the founders of Fifth Gear Garms right here on our live show ahead of Silverstone. And we're going to have a huge contest. We're trying to figure out if we're going to do a few small contests or one big one, but it's going to be a great time for them to showcase their brand, pick a couple of big winners. So you won't want to miss our live show next Saturday for Silverstone.
Yeah, and definitely check out their website. They've just had a relaunch, actually. So there's some really good stuff on there. So definitely, if you haven't been on there for a while, really worth checking out.
Yes, their stuff with Gravel Trap Graphics is terrific. It's always behind Rob on his wall. And Terry, I think you've got one just over your left shoulder with Vegas.
Yeah.
Awesome. All right, let's hit this wheel. It's Luke.
Congratulations, Luke.
Great work, Luke. And for anyone who's just joining the show for the first time this year, Luke was in the top 10 last season. He joined us with the P2 runner-up Bruno on our last live show of the year, talking about their teams and what that final league deciding matchup looked like. So really grateful for Luke's partnership over these last few years. Terry, we've reached the end of the hour. Any final thoughts?
Oh. No, just don't forget to lock your team in, especially if you're not in the UK and you've got a really weird time.
That's a great point. North American people, it's 6 a.m. Eastern tomorrow for the sprint race. Make sure you lock it before you go to bed tonight or wake up nice and early. We're going to be posting this video, so if you have any more questions, feel free to leave it in the comments of the YouTube video or in our fan amp base. Terry, thanks so much for coming on again. This was a great show.
No worries. It's good to be back.
And thank you all for watching. We'll see you next week in the run-up to Silverstone.
See you soon.